The morning sun spilled through the tall windows of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, casting long golden streaks across the polished floor. Travelers hurried in every direction, rolling suitcases behind them, clutching coffee cups, checking flight boards with tired eyes. Among them walked a girl named Amari, her fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of a small navy blue backpack. She was 12, with thoughtful brown eyes and braids neatly tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat. It wasn't just any hat. This one had been stitched by her grandmother's hands before she passed last winter, each thread carrying a story, each flower embroidered along the brim a memory. Across the front in soft ivory thread were the words, "Rooted," a quiet reminder that no matter where life took her, she came from something strong. Beside her walked her mother, Dr. Nia Holloway. Nia moved with a calm kind of certainty, the kind that didn't need to announce itself. She wore a simple charcoal blazer, dark slacks, and low heels. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed authority. To most people passing by, she looked like any other professional heading to a business trip. Few would guess she was the CEO of Skyward Airways, the very airline they were about to board. She hadn't planned to fly this route today, but an unexpected family matter in Chicago had pulled her away from her usual schedule, and she'd decided last minute to bring Amari along. The girl needed a change of scenery, and Nia needed her close. They checked in without fuss, breezed through security, and found their gate just as boarding began. The plane was a mid-sized jet, clean and modern, with Skyward's signature sky blue accents along the overhead bins. They were seated in row 12, window and aisle. Amari took the window, pressing her forehead gently against the cool glass as ground crew scurried below, preparing the aircraft for departure. She adjusted her hat, making sure it sat just right. It shaded her eyes from the bright tarmac lights and, more importantly, gave her a little bubble of comfort in a space that often felt too loud, too fast, too impersonal. Nia watched her daughter with a soft smile. She knew how much that hat meant, not just as a keepsake, but as armor. After her grandmother's passing, Amari had become quieter, more observant, as if trying to hold on to the world by noticing every small detail. The hat was part of that. It wasn't worn out of defiance or fashion. It was worn out of love. As the cabin filled, the flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced ease, smiling, checking seatbelts, stowing bags. One of them, a young woman named Cora, stood near the front galley, clipboard in hand. She was in her mid-20s with a bright smile and a crisp uniform. She took her job seriously, almost too seriously. Rules were rules in her mind, and she believed following them to the letter was the only way to keep things running smoothly. She'd been with Skyward for 2 years, and though she hadn't flown with many executives, she prided herself on treating everyone the same. Or so she thought. When Cora reached row 12, she paused. Her eyes landed on Amari's hat. She'd already asked a few passengers to remove baseball caps or beanies during boarding, standard procedure, she'd been told, to ensure clear identification and visibility during safety checks. But Amari's hat was different. It wasn't covering her face. It wasn't bulky. Still, Cora saw it as a violation. "Hi there," Cora said cheerfully, bending slightly to meet Amari's eye level. "I'm going to need you to take that hat off, sweetie." "Airline policy." Amari looked up, startled. She glanced at her mother, who gave a small, reassuring nod. "It's okay," Nia murmured. But Amari hesitated. It's special," she said softly. "My grandma made it." Cora's smile didn't fade, but it tightened at the edges. "I understand, honey, but we can't make exceptions. Everyone has to follow the same rules." Amari's throat tightened. She didn't want to cause a scene. She didn't want to seem difficult. Slowly, she reached up. But before her fingers could touch the brim, Cora leaned in and gently lifted the hat off her head. The motion was quick, almost casual. But to Amari it felt like a theft. She froze. Her eyes dropped to her lap, blinking fast to keep tears from spilling. The hat, still warm from her head, now rested in Cora's hands like a forgotten prop. Nia didn't move. Not yet. But something shifted inside her, quiet and sharp, like a switch flipping in the dark. She watched as Cora placed the hat on the empty middle seat without a word, then moved on to the next row, already asking another passenger to stow their bag properly. Around them, the cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight hum, overhead announcements, the clink of ice in cups, the rustle of magazines. But for Amari, everything had gone still. She stared at her hands, folded tightly in her lap, trying to breathe through the sting of humiliation. It wasn't just that the hat was taken. It was the way it was taken. Like her words didn't matter. Like her feelings were an inconvenience. Nia reached over and placed a hand on her daughter's knee. "Look at me," she said, voice low but steady. Amari lifted her eyes, red-rimmed but dry. "You didn't do anything wrong," Nia said. "Not one thing." Amari nodded, swallowing hard. A few rows back, an older woman in a floral scarf watched the exchange with quiet concern. She'd seen it before. The small dismissals, the polite erasures that added up over a lifetime. She gave Amari a small knowing nod, the kind that said, "I see you." Amari managed a tiny smile in return. Up front, Cora finished her sweep and returned to the galley. She placed Amari's hat on a shelf beneath the counter, thinking nothing more of it. Just another rule enforced. Just another passenger complying. She didn't notice the way the captain glanced at her with a slight frown, or how the senior flight attendant paused mid-sentence when she saw where the hat had been stashed. Outside, the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway. The engines hummed to life, a deep, reassuring growl. Passengers buckled in, adjusted headsets, opened books. Amari kept her eyes on the window, watching Atlanta shrink beneath them. But her mind wasn't on the clouds. It was on her grandmother's hands, rough from years of gardening, patiently threading needle after needle to make something beautiful for her granddaughter. And now that something beautiful had been treated like a piece of clutter, Nia watched her daughter's reflection in the window. Shoulders tense, jaw set. She knew this moment would stay with Amari, not because of the hat itself, but because of what it represented. The first time someone in authority had decided her daughter's dignity was negotiable. She could let it go. They were already airborne. Making a scene mid-flight wouldn't bring the hat back or undo the hurt. And Nia had learned long ago that not every battle needed to be fought in the moment. Sometimes the real work happened after the dust settled. But she also knew this wasn't just about a hat. It was about respect. About who gets to decide what's appropriate and whose stories get dismissed as irrelevant. And as the plane lifted into the sky, climbing above the noise and the rush of the world below, Nia made a quiet promise not just to Amari, but to every child who'd ever been told to shrink themselves to fit someone else's comfort. This wouldn't end here. For now, though, she simply reached into her bag, pulled out a small notebook, and wrote 2 words on a fresh page. Policy review. Then she turned to Amari, squeezed her hand and whispered, "We're going to fix this." Amari didn't answer right away. But after a long moment, she leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, and for the first time since the hat was taken, she let out a slow, steady breath. Outside, the sky stretched wide and open, endless, forgiving, full of possibility. And somewhere in that vast blue, a small seed of change had just been planted. The plane leveled off somewhere above Tennessee, the hum of the engine settling into a steady rhythm. Most passengers had relaxed into the flight, some dozing, others watching movies or flipping through magazines. Amari had pulled out a sketchbook from her backpack and was drawing the clouds outside, her pencil moving in soft, careful lines. She hadn't touched the hat since it was taken. It still sat on the empty middle seat, slightly crumpled, like an afterthought. Nia watched her daughter from the corner of her eye. She saw the way Amari's shoulders stayed tense, how she kept her gaze fixed on the window even when the flight attendant passed by with drink orders. There was a quiet hurt there, the kind that didn't scream but settled deep. Nia knew that kind of hurt well. She'd carried it herself years ago, when she was just a junior analyst in a room full of men who talked over her, who mistook her calm for compliance. She'd learned to armor herself with competence, with results, with silence. But she never wanted Amari to have to do the same. She reached into her tote bag and pulled out her phone. With a few quick taps, she sent a message to her executive assistant. "Confirm my presence wasn't flagged in crew briefing for Flight 422. The reply came almost instantly. "It wasn't. You were booked under personal email, no internal alert sent." Nia exhaled. That explained why the flight attendant hadn't recognized her. Not that it mattered. Recognition wasn't the point. Respect was. She glanced toward the front of the cabin. Cora was chatting with another attendant near the galley, laughing about something. Nia caught a snippet. Kids these days think rules don't apply to them. The words landed like a stone in her chest. She looked back at Amari, who was now shading in the outline of a bird soaring through the clouds. Her daughter hadn't said a word about what happened. Not a complaint, not a tear, just quiet disappointment. And that silence hurt more than anger ever could. Naya thought about standing up right then, about walking to the front and introducing herself. But she stopped herself. This wasn't about making a spectacle. It was about making sure this didn't happen again, to Amari or to anyone else. Instead, she leaned closer to her daughter. "You okay?" she asked softly. Amari nodded without looking up. "Yeah, I wish she'd asked instead of just taking it." "I know," Nia said. "That wasn't okay." Amari finally met her eyes. "Do you think she did it because I'm black?" Nia didn't flinch. She never shielded Amari from hard truths, only from unnecessary pain. "I don't know her heart," she said carefully. "But I do know that people often treat things differently when they don't understand them. And sometimes, they treat people differently without even realizing it." Amari frowned, thinking, "Grandma always said, when they don't see your crown, wear it louder." Nia smiled faintly. She was a wise woman. A few rows behind them, a retired schoolteacher named Ms. Delaney watched the exchange. She'd taught for 32 years in a public school in Birmingham, and she'd seen hundreds of kids like Amari, bright, thoughtful, carrying more weight than their age should allow. She remembered the sting of being told to tone it down, to not make a fuss, to be grateful for what you've got. She'd spent her career teaching her students that their voices mattered, even when the world tried to quiet them. Now, watching this quiet mother and daughter navigate a moment that shouldn't have been so heavy, Ms. Delaney felt a familiar ache. She reached into her purse, pulled out a small pack of tissues, and leaned forward. "Excuse me, dear," she said gently to Amari. "Would you like one? The cabin air gets dry." Amari looked surprised, but took the tissue with a quiet, "Thank you." Ms. Delaney gave her a warm smile, one that held no pity, only understanding. "That's a beautiful hat," she added softly. "Looks like it's got stories in it." Amari's eyes lit up just a little. "My grandma made it." "I figured," Ms. Delaney said. "Only love stitches that kind of detail." For the first time since the incident, Amari sat up a little straighter. Up front, Cora finished her conversation and turned back toward the cabin. She didn't notice the subtle shift in energy, the quiet solidarity forming in row 12 and beyond. She was focused on her checklist, on making sure everything ran smoothly. She believed she'd done the right thing. After all, she hadn't yelled. She hadn't been rude. She'd just followed the rules. But rules, Naya knew, were only as good as the people who applied them, and the context in which they were used. A baseball cap on a white teenager in 14B hadn't been touched. A beanie on a man in 8A had been left alone. Only Amari's hat, distinct, cultural, meaningful, had been singled out. Nia's phone buzzed again. Another message from her assistant. "Crew manifest shows Cora Mitchell, 2 years with Skyward, clean record. No prior complaints." Good, Nia thought. That meant this wasn't about malice. It was about blind spots. And blind spots could be fixed. She took a slow breath and stood. The movement was calm, deliberate. She didn't slam her tray table or make a show of it. She simply rose, smoothed her blazer, and walked toward the front of the plane with the quiet confidence of someone who didn't need to prove her place in the world. Cora looked up as Nia approached. "Ma'am, can I help you?" Nia didn't smile. She didn't frown. Her voice was even, clear. "I'd like to speak with the lead flight attendant and the captain, please." Cora blinked. "Is everything all right?" "I'll explain when they're both here." A flicker of unease crossed Cora's face, but she nodded and tapped her colleague, who disappeared toward the cockpit. Within moments, the lead attendant, a woman in her 40s with silver streaks in her hair and a name tag that read Elena, joined them, followed shortly by the captain, a tall man with kind eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. Nia waited until they were all standing just outside the cockpit door, out of earshot of most passengers. Then she said, "My name is Dr. Nia Holloway. I'm the CEO of Skyward Airways." The effect was immediate. Elena's eyes widened. The captain straightened slightly. Cora went pale. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Nia continued, her voice still calm. "But I need to address what happened with my daughter." She explained everything, how Amari had been wearing a personal, non-obstructive hat that held deep emotional value, how she'd tried to explain its significance, and how Cora had removed it without consent. She pointed out that no other passenger had been asked to remove similar headwear. She didn't accuse. She stated facts. "This isn't about one hat," Nia said. "It's about whether our policies are applied fairly, and whether our crew understands the difference between enforcing rules and respecting people." Elena looked genuinely troubled. "We had no idea you were on board, Dr. Holloway, and I'm so sorry your daughter was made to feel uncomfortable." The captain nodded. "We'll look into this immediately." Cora stood frozen, her earlier confidence gone. I didn't mean any harm," she stammered. "I thought I was just doing my job." "I believe you did," Nia said. "But good intentions aren't enough if the impact is hurtful." She paused, letting that sink in. "I'm not asking for punishment. I'm asking for reflection, and for change." Elena exchanged a glance with the captain. "What would you suggest?" "First," Nia said, "return my daughter's hat to her with an apology. Not because I'm the CEO, but because it's the right thing to do. Second, I'd like a full review of our headwear policy, with input from cultural sensitivity experts. And third, I want mandatory training for all cabin crew on implicit bias and respectful passenger interaction." The captain nodded slowly. "We can start that process as soon as we land." "Good," Nia said. Then, after a beat, "And please, don't announce who I am to the rest of the crew. This isn't about me. It's about making sure no child feels small on our planes again." She turned and walked back to her seat. Amari looked up as her mother sat down. "What happened?" "They're going to fix it," Nia said simply. Just then, Elena appeared at their row. She held out the hat, now carefully smoothed and placed on a folded napkin. "Amari," she said gently, "I'm truly sorry. You didn't deserve that. This belongs to you." Amari took it slowly, running her fingers over the brim. Then quietly she said, "Thank you." Elena gave a small nod and retreated. Nia watched as Amari placed the hat back on her head, adjusting it with care. This time it sat like a crown. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, clear, open, full of second chances. And inside the cabin, something quiet but powerful had begun to shift. Not with shouting or blame, but with truth, accountability, and the kind of leadership that lifts others up instead of tearing them down. The rest of the flight passed in a quiet hum, the kind of calm that settles after a storm has moved through. Amari kept her hat on, fingers occasionally brushing the embroidered word "rooted" like a touchstone. She didn't say much, but her posture had changed, less hunched, more sure. She even offered a small smile to Ms. Delaney when their eyes met again, and the older woman returned it with a gentle nod, as if to say, "You're seen. You matter." Nia watched her daughter with a mix of pride and sorrow. Pride, because Amari had held on to her dignity even when it was nearly taken from her. Sorrow, because her child had to learn that lesson so young. But there was also resolve. This moment wouldn't vanish into the routine of airline operations. It wouldn't be filed away as one of those things. Nia had spent years building Skyward Airways not just as a business, but as a reflection of the world she believed in, one where people were treated with care, not just compliance. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, the captain's voice came over the intercom, smooth and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our approach into O'Hare. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened." Cora stayed near the front galley for the rest of the flight. She didn't look toward row 12. Her usual cheerful energy was gone, replaced by a quiet tension. She kept busy, restocking napkins, checking drink carts, folding blankets. But her movements were stiff, her smile absent. She replayed the moment over and over in her head. The girl's wide eyes, the mother's calm voice. The crushing weight of realizing she'd hurt someone while thinking she was just doing her job. She hadn't meant to be unkind. That was the worst part. She'd grown up believing that fairness meant treating everyone exactly the same. But now she wondered, what if the same wasn't always fair? What if her idea of neutrality had actually been blind to something important? When the wheels touched down and the seatbelt sign clicked off, passengers began gathering their belongings. Nia waited, letting others deplane first. She didn't want attention. She didn't want whispers. She just wanted to make sure the next steps happened the right way. As they stepped into the jet bridge, Elena approached again, this time with a man in a Skyward Airways polo shirt, station manager for Chicago O'Hare. Dr. Holloway, he said, extending a hand. I'm Dev. I've been briefed on what happened. We'd like to speak with you privately before you leave the terminal. Nia nodded. Of course, she turned to Amari. Wait for me at the gate bench, okay? I'll be right back. Amari sat down, her backpack in her lap, hat still firmly in place. She watched her mother walk away with the station manager and Elena, their voices low and serious. She didn't feel anxious anymore. She felt witnessed. Inside a small office just off the gate area, Nia sat across from Dev and Elena. The room was plain. White walls, a desk, a water cooler humming in the corner, but the conversation was anything but ordinary. I've reviewed the cabin footage, Dev began. And I've spoken with Cora. She's shaken. She says she didn't realize the hat had personal meaning and she regrets how she handled it. Nia listened without interrupting. Regret is a start, she said finally. But it's not enough. What matters is what we do next. Dev leaned forward. We're prepared to offer you and your daughter compensation. First-class upgrades for life, travel vouchers, whatever you'd like. Nia shook her head. I don't want perks. I want policy change. I want training that doesn't just check a box, but actually changes how our team sees people. And I want this incident documented, not as a complaint, but as a learning moment for the entire company. Elena nodded. We can start retraining within the week. We've worked with a diversity consultant before. I'll reach out to her today. Good, Nia said. And I want Cora included, not punished, but invited to learn. If she's willing. She is, Elena said quickly. She asked if there was anything she could do to make it right. Nia paused. Then let her write a letter, not to me. To my daughter, honest, no excuses. Just accountability. Dev exchanged a glance with Elena. We'll make sure it happens. Before she left, Nia added one more thing. From now on, any passenger wearing culturally or religiously significant headwear should never be asked to remove it unless it poses a direct safety risk. And even then it should be a conversation, not a command. They agreed. Back at the gate, Amari stood as soon as she saw her mother. Everything okay? Better than okay, Nia said, slipping an arm around her shoulders. We're going to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. They walked through the terminal together, blending into the stream of travelers. No one recognized Nia. No one pointed or stared. To the world, they were just a mother and daughter heading to baggage claim. But something had shifted between them. A deeper trust, a shared understanding that standing up for what's right doesn't always mean shouting. Sometimes it means speaking clearly, calmly, and with purpose. Over the next few days, the story didn't go viral. There were no headlines, no outraged social media posts, but inside Skyward Airways, it rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Cora spent that evening at her kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. She'd rewritten her apology 3 times already. The first draft was too formal. The second sounded defensive. Now, on the 4th try, she wrote from the heart. Dear Amari, she began, I'm writing to say I'm sorry, not just for taking your hat, but for not listening when you told me it mattered. I thought I was following the rules, but I forgot that people come before policies. Your hat wasn't just fabric. It was love, and I treated it like clutter. That wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't who I want to be. I'm learning, and I hope you can accept my apology. She folded the letter carefully and handed it to Elena the next morning. Meanwhile, Nia held a virtual meeting with Skyward's leadership team. She didn't scold. She shared. She told them about Amari's quiet strength, about the way her daughter had held on to her dignity, even when it was nearly stripped away. She talked about the difference between equality and equity, how treating everyone the same only works if everyone starts from the same place. We're not just moving people from one city to another, she said. We're holding space for their stories, their grief, their joy. And if we forget that, we've failed. Within a week, Skyward announced a new initiative, the Passenger Dignity Program. It included revised guidelines on headwear, mandatory workshops on cultural humility led by community educators, and a confidential feedback system where passengers could report disrespectful interactions without fear of dismissal. Cora volunteered to be part of the pilot training group. She listened, really listened, as a Black cultural historian explained the significance of head coverings in African, Caribbean, and Muslim traditions. She learned that for many, these items weren't fashion, they were identity, faith, resistance. She raised her hand during one session and admitted, "I never thought about it before. I just saw a rule." "That's why we're here," the instructor said gently. "Not to shame, but to see." Back in Atlanta, Amari returned to school. She wore her hat on the bus ride in, and when a classmate asked about it, she told the whole story. Not with anger, but with quiet pride. Her teacher, moved by her words, invited her to share it during a classroom discussion on fairness. And Nia, she kept the policy draft on her desk, framed beside a photo of her mother, the woman who'd taught her that leadership isn't about power, but about protection. The incident never became a scandal. But in the quiet corners of an airline, in the hearts of a mother and daughter, and in the changed behavior of a young flight attendant, it became something far more lasting, a seed of real, human change. The days after the flight settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and charged with quiet purpose. Back in Atlanta, Amari returned to school, her hat now a familiar sight in the hallways. Some kids asked about it, others just nodded when they saw it, as if they understood without needing an explanation. She didn't tell the story for attention. She told it because it mattered. And each time she did, her voice grew steadier, her shoulders a little straighter. At home, Nia kept her promise. She didn't let the moment fade into the background noise of corporate routines. Instead, she used it as a compass. Within a week, she'd assembled a small but passionate team. 2 frontline flight attendants, a cultural consultant who'd worked with transit agencies across the country, a passenger experience lead, and even a high school student from a youth advocacy group. Their mission: rebuild Skyward's approach to passenger interaction from the ground up. The first workshop was held in a sunlit conference room at Skyward's headquarters. Cora sat near the back, hands folded in her lap, listening more than speaking. She'd expected to be scolded, maybe even sidelined. Instead, she was invited to share what she'd learned and what she still didn't understand. When the cultural consultant asked the group, "What does respect look like in your daily work?" Cora raised her hand. "I used to think respect meant treating everyone exactly the same," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "But now I see that's not always true. Sometimes treating people fairly means seeing their differences and honoring them." A murmur of agreement moved through the room. One veteran flight attendant, a man who'd been with the airline for 20 years, nodded slowly. "I've asked folks to remove turbans, hijabs, even yarmulkes," he admitted. "I thought I was just following procedure. But I never asked why they wore them. Never even thought to." That honesty opened the door for others. Stories poured out, moments of misunderstanding, small slights that had gone unchallenged because that's just how it's done. By the end of the session, the team had drafted the first version of what would become the Passenger Dignity Guidelines. Clear, practical, and rooted in empathy rather than enforcement. Meanwhile, Amari received a letter in the mail. It wasn't fancy, just a plain white envelope with her name written in neat cursive. Inside was Cora's apology, exactly as she'd written it, with no corporate stamp or legal disclaimer. Amari read it twice, then tucked it into the back pocket of her sketchbook, right behind a drawing of her grandmother's hands holding a needle and thread. She didn't write back right away. But a week later, during a school project on community healing, she drew a new picture, a flight attendant and a girl, standing side by side, both wearing hats, one a uniform cap, the other wide-brimmed and embroidered. Beneath it she wrote, "Sometimes saying sorry is the first step to doing better." She mailed a copy to Skyward's main office, addressed simply to Cora. Back at the airline, change moved faster than anyone expected. The new guidelines were rolled out in phases. First, a pilot program on select routes, then mandatory training for all new hires. Existing crew were offered voluntary sessions at first, but within 2 months, attendance became part of annual certification. Not as punishment, but as professional growth. Cora signed up for every session. She asked questions. She took notes. She even started a small group chat with other attendants who wanted to keep learning. They shared articles, personal stories, even photos of meaningful headwear from different cultures. What began as damage control became something deeper, a community of care. Nia made sure the changes weren't just performative. She visited training sessions unannounced, not as a CEO but as a listener. She sat in the back, notebook in hand, absorbing the conversations. Once she overheard a young attendant say, "I never realized my neutral tone could still sound cold to someone who's already nervous about flying." That sentence stayed with Nia. She quoted it in her next leadership meeting. Outside the company, word began to spread, not through press releases but through passengers. A woman traveling with her hijab noticed the crew didn't ask her to adjust it during boarding. A Sikh man flying with his young son was greeted with a respectful nod toward his turban. An elder from a native community wrote to customer service to thank them for the change in tone. These weren't grand gestures. They were small moments of dignity, restored, and then came the invitation. It arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, an email from a community center in Chicago. They were hosting a youth workshop on identity and belonging, and they'd heard about Amari's story through Ms. Delaney, the retired teacher from the flight, who now volunteered there. Would Amari be willing to speak? Just for 10 minutes, just to share what it felt like to have something personal dismissed, and how she chose to respond with grace instead of anger. Nia showed the email to Amari over dinner. "Only if you want to," she said. "No pressure," Amari stirred her soup, thinking. "Did Cora ever say she was sorry to anyone else?" she asked. "I don't know," Nia admitted. "But I do know she's trying," Amari nodded. "Then yeah, I'll go." The workshop was held in a bright open room with mismatched chairs and walls covered in student art. About 30 kids, ages 10 to 16, sat in a circle. Amari stood at the front, hat on, hands clasped. She didn't read from notes. She just talked. About her grandmother, about the flight, about how it felt when someone took something precious without asking. "I was mad," she said honestly. "But my mom taught me that being mad doesn't mean you have to be mean. You can be hurt and still choose to help fix things." After she finished, a boy raised his hand. "Did you forgive her?" Amari thought for a moment. "I'm not sure forgive is the right word, but I believe she's trying to be better, and that matters." As the group broke for snacks, a woman approached Amari. She was in her late 20s, wearing a skyward uniform blazer over jeans, off-duty. "It was Cora. I didn't know you'd be here," Cora said softly. "I volunteer with this center sometimes. I help with the teen mentorship program." Amari looked at her, really looked at her, not as the person who took her hat, but as someone who'd shown up again and again to do better. "I got your drawing," Cora said, eyes a little shiny. "It's hanging in my kitchen." Amari smiled, small but real. "Good." They didn't hug. They didn't make a big scene, but they stood there for a moment. Two people connected by a mistake and a choice to grow from it. Later, as Nia drove Amari home, the city lights flickered past the car windows. "You did good today," she said. Amari leaned her head against the seat. "I just told the truth." Sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do. Back at Skyward, the Passenger Dignity Initiative was officially adopted company-wide. It wasn't perfect. There were still missteps, still learning curves. But the culture was shifting, from compliance to connection, from policy to people. And in a quiet office on the 12th floor, Nia kept one thing on her desk, Amari's original sketch of the clouds now framed. Beneath it, she'd written a single line in her own hand. "Dignity isn't given. It's recognized." The flight from Atlanta to Chicago had lasted less than 2 hours, but its impact would echo far longer, not in headlines, but in changed hearts, revised rules, and the quiet courage of a girl who wore her crown, even when someone tried to take it. 6 months after the flight from Atlanta to Chicago, the changes at Skyward Airways had settled into something real, not just policy on paper, but practice in the air. Flight attendants no longer recited rules like robots. They asked questions. They listened. They noticed. A passenger wearing a kufi, a hijab, a beaded head wrap, or a sun hat like Amari's was met with a nod, not a command. Safety was still priority one, but it was now paired with something just as vital: respect. The Passenger Dignity Initiative had grown beyond headwear. It now included guidance on pronoun use, support for neurodiverse travelers, and even small things, like not rushing elderly passengers during boarding or offering water first to someone who looked anxious. These weren't grand gestures. They were human ones, and passengers noticed. Skyward's customer satisfaction scores rose, not because of flashy upgrades, but because people felt seen. Cora was no longer just a flight attendant. She'd become a peer trainer, someone new hires looked to when they weren't sure how to handle a delicate moment. She still made mistakes, Once she mispronounced a passenger's name and had to pause, apologize, and ask again. But that moment, awkward as it was, became a teaching point in her next session. Getting it right matters more than pretending you already know. She also kept volunteering at the community center in Chicago. Every other Saturday, she helped teens with college applications or just sat with them over hot chocolate, listening to their worries about school, family, identity. She never mentioned the airline unless asked. She was just Cora, someone who'd learned that humility could be a kind of strength. Amari, now 13, had grown into her voice. She'd spoken at 2 more youth events, not as a victim, but as someone who believed change was possible when people chose to listen. Her sketchbook was full. Drawings of hands holding, of hats of all kinds, of planes flying over cities with roots stretching down into the earth. She still wore her grandmother's hat, especially on hard days, and every time she did, she felt that quiet strength return. One spring afternoon, Nia received an invitation she hadn't expected. It was from a national aviation conference, a gathering of airline executives, safety regulators, and industry leaders. They wanted her to give the keynote, not about profits or routes, but about culture. About how one moment of disrespect handled with care could spark a company-wide transformation. She almost said no. She didn't like the spotlight. But then she thought of Amari, standing in front of strangers and speaking her truth without flinching. If her daughter could do that, so could she. The conference was held in a sleek convention center in Denver. Nia walked onto the stage in a simple navy dress. No flashy jewelry, no rehearsed theatrics. She began not with data, but with a story. "I want to tell you about a hat," she said, her voice calm, clear. Not because it was expensive or rare, but because it was loved. It was made by a grandmother for her granddaughter. And one day on a routine flight, it was taken away. Not with malice, but with blindness. She didn't name names. She didn't shame. She simply laid out what happened, what it revealed, and what they chose to do about it. "We could have buried it," she said, called it an isolated incident, moved on. But that would have been a missed chance. Because real leadership isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about what you build from them. She spoke about the training, the listening sessions, the quiet courage of frontline staff who admitted they didn't have all the answers. She shared feedback from passengers, like the Sikh father who said, "For the first time, my son didn't feel like he had to explain his faith to fly." Or the elderly black woman who wrote, "I've been flying for 50 years. This is the first time I felt like I belonged." When she finished, the room was silent for a beat, then rose in applause. Not the polite kind, but the kind that comes from being moved. Afterward, several airline CEOs approached her. One asked, "How do you scale this without it becoming just another HR requirement?" Nia smiled. "You don't scale it from the top. You grow it from the ground. You trust your people to lead with heart, and you give them the tools to do it well." Back home, Amari was waiting with a drawing she'd made for her mom. Nia on stage, small but steady with a crowd leaning in to listen. At the bottom, Amari had written, "You turned pain into a path." That summer, Skyward Airways launched a new program in partnership with schools and community groups, Voices in the Sky. It invited young people to share stories about travel, identity, and belonging. Selected pieces were printed in seatback magazines and read aloud during select flights. Amari's essay, "My Hat, My Crown," and was the first featured. She didn't write it for fame. She wrote it because she wanted other kids to know. Your story matters. Your dignity isn't up for debate. One evening, as the two of them sat on their porch watching fireflies blink in the dusk, Amari asked, "Do you think that flight attendant ever thought about us after that day?" Nia sipped her tea. "I think she did, and I hope she knows she helped make something better." "She did," Amari said softly, "because she chose to listen." Months later, on a cool October morning, Amari boarded another Skyward flight, this time alone, heading to Chicago for a weekend with her aunt. She wore her hat, of course. As she settled into her window seat, the flight attendant paused at her row. "Nice hat," the woman said with a warm smile. "Looks like it's got history." Amari looked up. "It does, my grandma made it." The attendant nodded. "Then it's not just a hat. It's a legacy," Amari smiled. "Yeah, it is." No one asked her to take it off. No one even glanced twice. She leaned back, watching the tarmac blur as the plane taxied toward the runway. Outside, the sky waited wide open, full of possibility, and high above the clouds in cabins across the country, Small acts of kindness were happening every day. A gentle question instead of a demand, a pause before an assumption, a choice to see the person, not just the passenger. The story of the hat never became a scandal. It never needed to, because real change doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, in a mother's steady voice, in a daughter's quiet courage, in a flight attendant's apology, in a policy rewritten with care. And in those whispers, whole worlds can shift. Years from now, when Amari boards a plane as a woman, maybe a teacher, maybe an artist, maybe something no one's even named yet, she'll still wear that hat. And if someone asks about I,